Some wounds never heal, they just teach us how to carry the weight. For 60-year-old Hank McCall, every sunrise in Cedar Ridge reminds him of all the people he's lost and all the words he never got to say. His wife Martha is gone. His daughter lives 1,000 miles away, and his ranch feels like a monument to everything that used to matter. Most days, Hank just goes through the motions, fixing fences and feeding cattle, wondering if anyone would notice if he disappeared tomorrow. But when a group of young ranch hands start picking on Lila, a 14-year-old orphan girl with nothing but the clothes on her back, something changes. They dare her to ride at the annual rodeo, thinking it'll be good for a laugh. What happens next shocks everyone. But what secret makes this girl's riding so incredible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in Cedar Ridge carried the familiar scent of dust and sagebrush, mixed with the earthy smell of horses and hay that had defined Hank McCall's world for the better part of 4 decades. He stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and amber. The silence stretched across the valley like a blanket, broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle and the creak of the old windmill that Martha had always meant to have him oil. Martha, even after 5 years, her name still caught in his throat like a burr. He could see her everywhere he looked, in the flower boxes she'd insisted on mounting under every window, now overrun with weeds he couldn't bring himself to pull. In the rocking chair beside him, where she'd spent countless evenings, reading aloud from whatever novel had caught her fancy that week. In the way the morning light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating the spot where she'd stand making biscuits, flour dusting her apron and humming old hymns under her breath. Hank took a sip of his coffee and grimaced. Still couldn't make it the way she had, no matter how many times he'd watched her measure the grounds. Some secrets, he supposed, died with the keeper. The ranch house itself told the story of better days. Paint peeled from the shutters in long, curling strips. The front steps sagged slightly where the foundation had settled. Inside, rooms that had once echoed with laughter and conversation now held only the tick of the mantel clock and the occasional groan of old wood settling. Sarah's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it when she'd gone off to college 15 years ago, though she'd only been back 3 times since the funeral. Each visit shorter than the last, each goodbye more stilted. Denver was where Sarah belonged now. She'd made that clear. Big city opportunities, important career, a life that had no room for the dusty memories of a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. Hank understood, even if it left a hollow ache in his chest. Martha had understood too before the cancer took her. She's got to make her own way, Martha had said, her voice barely a whisper in those final weeks. Like we did when we were young, but young felt like a lifetime ago. At 60, Hank felt every one of his years in his joints when he climbed out of bed each morning, in the way his back protested when he lifted hay bales, in the growing list of things that seemed more trouble than they were worth. The ranch that had once buzzed with activity, hired hands during roundup season, neighbors stopping by for coffee and conversation, Sarah bringing home friends from school, now felt like a museum of his former life. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd become the best horse trainer in 3 counties just as he'd stopped caring about the reputation. Word still spread when Hank McCall had a difficult horse that needed breaking, but his heart wasn't in it the way it used to be. He went through the motions because motion was better than stillness, because an empty mind had too much time to wander down paths that led nowhere good. Cedar Ridge itself hadn't changed much in the decades since Hank had first brought Martha here as his bride. Main Street still consisted of the same dozen buildings it had when they'd arrived. Peterson's medical clinic, where old Doc Peterson had delivered half the town's children and tended to their scraped knees and broken bones. Williams Hardware and Feed, run by Sheriff Williams' brother Tom, who'd taken over when their father retired. May's General Store, where May Hutchins had held court behind the cash register for 37 years, keeper of every secret and spreader of every bit of news worth knowing. The Cedar Ridge Cafe still served the same chicken-fried steak and apple pie that had been on the menu since Hank was a young man, though the portions had gotten smaller and the prices higher. The Frontier Saloon still drew the same crowd of ranchers and cowboys every Friday night, though more of them had gray in their beards and lines around their eyes than used to be the case. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where family names carried weight going back 3 generations, where newcomers were politely welcomed but never quite belonged until they'd weathered at least one brutal winter and proved they weren't going to fold at the first sign of hardship. It was the kind of place that valued tradition above innovation, where a man's word was his bond and where respect was earned through consistency rather than grand gestures, which made the presence of Lila Jenkins all the more remarkable. Nobody quite knew where the girl had come from. She'd simply appeared one day about 6 months ago, thin as a fence post and twice as stubborn, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that had seen better decades. May had been the first to spot her digging through the dumpster behind the general store, looking for anything edible. Too proud to ask for help, but too hungry to let pride be her only guide, the girl, 14, maybe 15, though she could have passed for younger if not for the old soul that looked out through her dark eyes, had found herself an abandoned barn on the Williamson property about 2 miles outside town. Old man Williamson had been dead 3 years now, his property tied up in some legal dispute between distant relatives who couldn't agree on what to do with the land. The barn leaked when it rained, and probably wasn't much warmer than sleeping outside when winter came calling, but it was shelter of a sort. Lila, she'd never offered a last name, just Lila. Take it or leave it, had made herself useful around town, in the quiet way of someone who understood that charity came with strings attached, but work earned respect. She swept floors at May's in exchange for day-old bread and canned goods past their prime. She mucked stalls for anyone willing to pay cash, no questions asked. She helped Doc Peterson organize his supply closet and learned to change bandages with steady hands that never trembled, no matter how bad the wound. Most folks in Cedar Ridge had developed a grudging respect for the girl's work ethic, even if they maintained their reserve about her origins. She was polite when spoken to, kept her head down, and never caused trouble. But there was something in the way she looked at horses that caught Hank's attention, a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with longing. He'd noticed her watching from the fence line when he worked with problem horses in his training corral. She never came closer, never tried to strike up a conversation, but something in her posture reminded him of Sarah at that age, back when his daughter had spent every free moment in the barn, pestering him to let her help with the training, chattering about which horses she'd ride when she was older and how she'd win ribbons at every rodeo from here to Cheyenne. Those had been good days, before Sarah decided horses were childish, before college opened up a world that made ranch life seem small and limiting, before Martha got sick and everything else became secondary to doctor, visits and treatments that promised hope but delivered only delays, the young ranch hands who worked the various spreads. Around Cedar Ridge were a different story entirely. Tommy Brennan, Jake Morrison and Buster Walsh had grown up together, gone through school together, and now spent their time working cattle and raising hell in roughly equal measure. They were good boys mostly, the kind who'd help pull your truck out of a ditch or lend a hand during branding season without being asked. But they were also young men with too much energy and not enough sense. The kind who thought practical jokes were the height of humor and who sometimes let their mouths run ahead of their brains. Tommy was the unofficial leader of the group, blessed with the kind of easy charm that made people overlook his occasional lapses in judgment. His father had been a champion bronc rider before a bad fall ended his career and his life when Tommy was 12. The boy carried that legacy like a weight, always trying to prove himself worthy of a name that cast a long shadow. Jake, not related to the famous Jake Morrison, though he never corrected people who assumed otherwise, was the follower of the group, always ready to go along with whatever scheme Tommy hatched. He was harmless enough on his own, but dangerous in the way that weak men became when they wanted to impress stronger personalities. Buster was the wild card, smart enough to know better, but too proud to back down once he'd committed to something stupid. He had a mean streak that sometimes surfaced when he'd been drinking, though he kept it in check around anyone who might call him on it. Lately, the three of them had taken to amusing themselves at Lila's expense. Nothing too obvious. They were smart enough to keep their harassment subtle, the kind of thing that looked like harmless teasing to casual observers, but carried an edge of cruelty that cut deeper than any physical blow. They'd make comments just loud enough for her to hear about charity cases and drifters who didn't know their place. They'd accidentally knock over whatever she was carrying, then make a show of helping her pick it up while their friends snickered. Hank had witnessed enough of these incidents to recognize the pattern, but he'd held his tongue. Getting involved in other people's business was a good way to make enemies, and he'd had enough conflict in his life. Besides, the girl seemed to handle herself well enough. She never rose to the bait, never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her break, but watching her endure their petty cruelties stirred something in Hank that he'd thought had died with Martha. A protective instinct that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the memory of what it felt like to be responsible for someone else's well-being. The same instinct that had once made him check Sarah's room every night before bed, just to make sure she was safe and sound. Now, standing on his porch in the early morning quiet, Hank found himself thinking about the girl more often than was probably appropriate for a man his age. Not in any way that would have shamed Martha's memory, but with the kind of wondering that came from seeing potential in unexpected places. There was something about the way Lila moved around horses, the way she seemed to understand their moods and respond to their needs without conscious thought, that reminded him of the best trainers he'd known. Natural horsemen were rare. You could teach technique and safety, build strength and confidence, but the kind of intuitive connection that made the difference between a good rider and a great one was something you were born with or you weren't. Hank had seen it in maybe a dozen people. In his 40 years of working with horses, he'd seen it in Martha, who could gentle a spooked mare with nothing but patience and soft words. He'd seen it in Sarah before she decided that horses were just another part of the life she was eager to leave behind. And he'd seen it in Lila, watching from the fence line with eyes that tracked every movement of horse and rider, as if she were memorizing lessons she might never get the chance to apply. The sun had cleared the mountains now, turning the morning from gold to white-hot silver. Time to start the day, time to feed the horses and check the water troughs, and go through all the familiar routines that kept him moving forward, even when he couldn't see the point. Time to stop thinking about things that weren't his business and focus on the work that was. But as Hank finished his coffee and headed for the barn, Martha's old horse brush hanging from its familiar hook by the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming to Cedar Ridge, whether he was ready for it or not. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he could almost hear Martha's voice, gentle but insistent as it had been in life. Sometimes the best way to heal your own heart is to help mend someone else's. The morning stretched ahead of him, full of familiar tasks and comfortable solitude. But for the first time in months, Hank found himself wondering what the day might bring beyond the usual routine. In a town where nothing ever changed, that wondering felt almost like hope. The annual Cedar Ridge Rodeo was still 3 weeks away, but the town had already begun its transformation from sleepy ranching community to something approaching genuine excitement. Hand-painted signs appeared in storefront windows advertising everything from barbecue dinners to craft booths selling leather goods and handmade jewelry. The local 4-H club had set up a booth outside May's General Store, selling raffle tickets for a hand-stitched quilt that would be displayed in the town square until the big day. For Cedar Ridge, the rodeo represented more than entertainment. It was validation. Proof that their small corner of the world still mattered, still produced the kind of authentic Western culture that people drove hundreds of miles to experience. Families planned their summer vacations around the event. Former residents made their annual pilgrimage home. Local ranchers spent weeks preparing their best stock for the various competitions, knowing that a strong showing could translate into breeding contracts and enhanced reputations that would carry them through the rest of the year. Hank had mixed feelings about the whole affair. There had been a time when he and Martha had looked forward to Rodeo Week with genuine enthusiasm. Martha had served on the organizing committee for 15 years, coordinating the craft fair and managing the volunteer schedule with the kind of cheerful efficiency that made everyone wonder how they'd managed without her. Hank had contributed his expertise in selecting and preparing the broncs and bulls that would challenge the riders, taking pride in providing animals that were difficult but fair, dangerous enough to test a cowboy's skill, but not so unpredictable as to cause unnecessary injury. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Since Martha's death, Hank's involvement had been limited to the bare minimum of professional obligation. He'd helped select the stock because his reputation demanded it and because the rodeo committee needed his expertise, but the joy had gone out of it. Where he'd once seen celebration and community, he now saw mainly noise and commotion that disrupted the peaceful rhythm of his solitude. Still, when Tom Williams had stopped by the ranch 2 days ago with a crumpled rodeo flyer and a request for help with this year's bronc selection, Hank hadn't been able to refuse entirely. The animals would need evaluating, and there weren't many people in the county with the experience to judge which horses would provide good rides without putting Cowboys in the hospital. The flyer now sat on his kitchen table, its bright red lettering, proclaiming the 47th annual Cedar Ridge Rodeo, and listing all the traditional events: saddle bronc, bareback bronc, bull riding, calf roping, barrel racing, and team penning. At the bottom, in smaller print, it mentioned the various side competitions: pie contests, horseshoe tournaments, and the children's stick horse races that always drew the loudest cheers from the crowd. Hank was studying the schedule over his morning coffee when he heard voices from the direction of the main road. Not unusual, the route to town passed close enough to his property that conversations often drifted over, especially when people were walking rather than driving. But something in the tone of these voices made him pause, made him set down his mug and listen more carefully. Laughter. The kind of laughter that had an edge to it, the kind that usually came at someone else's expense. Hank recognized Tommy Brennan's voice immediately, followed by the distinctive cackle that belonged to Buster Walsh. They were walking toward town, probably heading to May's for supplies or to the cafe for breakfast, but they'd stopped somewhere near the fence line that separated Hank's property from the road. Curiosity overrode his usual reluctance to get involved in other people's business. Hank left his coffee on the table and stepped onto the front porch, positioning himself where he could see the road without being immediately visible to anyone passing by. What he saw made his jaw tighten with a familiar anger he'd been trying to avoid for months. Lila stood near the fence, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder and her hands wrapped around the top rail as she watched Hank's horses grazing in the near pasture. She was dressed in the same patched jeans and faded shirt she seemed to wear every day, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. From a distance, she looked even younger than her 14 years, small and vulnerable, in the way that should have inspired protection rather than predatory amusement. Tommy, Jake, and Buster had positioned themselves between Lila and the road, effectively trapping her against the fence. Their body language was casual enough. Hands in pockets, weight shifted to one leg, the picture of young men engaged in friendly conversation. But Hank could read the subtle signs of intimidation in their positioning, the way they'd formed a loose semicircle that made it difficult for Lila to leave without pushing past them. "I'm telling you, she's been watching those horses every day." "For weeks," Tommy was saying, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "Girls got it bad for riding, don't you think, boys?" "Can't blame her for dreaming," Jake added with a snicker, though dreaming and doing are two different things entirely. Lila hadn't moved from her position at the fence, but Hank could see The tension in her shoulders, the way she'd gone very still, in the way animals did when they sensed danger but hadn't yet decided whether to fight or flee. "You know what I think?" Buster's voice was louder than necessary pitch to carry. "I think our little friend here would make a fine addition to the rodeo this year. What do you say, Lila? You interested in showing these horses what you can?" "Do?" The girl finally turned to face them, her expression carefully neutral. "I should get to town. May's expecting me to help with inventory today. Now don't be in such a hurry," Tommy said, stepping sideways to block her path more directly. "We're having a friendly conversation here, neighbors getting to know each other and all that." "I know you well enough," Lila replied quietly, but there was steel in her voice that Hank recognized, the same tone Sarah had used as a teenager when pushed too far, the same careful control that suggested the speaker was measuring their words against potential consequences. "Well, that's not very neighborly," Jake said with mock hurt. "Here we are, trying to include you in the biggest event of the year, and you're acting like we're trying to cause trouble." Buster laughed, the sound harsh in the morning quiet. "Maybe she knows something we don't. Maybe she knows she'd make a fool of herself in front of the whole town." "That's not it," Tommy said, and there was something almost thoughtful in his voice that made Hank pay closer attention. "I think she's scared. I think she talks big about understanding horses, but when it comes time to actually climb on one, well, that's a different story entirely." Lila's knuckles had gone white where she gripped the fence rail, but her voice remained steady. "I never claimed to be a rider. But you want to be." Tommy pressed, stepping closer. "Anyone can see it in the way you watch. The way you study every move like you're memorizing it for some test you'll never get to take." There was truth in what Tommy said, and all four of them knew it. Hank could see it in the way Lila's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment, revealing the longing she'd been trying so hard to hide. "Tell you what," Tommy continued, pulling the rodeo flyer from his back pocket and unfolding it with theatrical ceremony. "We dare you. Enter the ladies' bronc riding competition. Show everyone in Cedar Ridge what you're really made of." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Hank found himself holding his breath, waiting to see how the girl would respond to what was clearly meant as a cruel joke. The ladies' bronc riding competition was open to any woman over 16, but the entry fee was $50, more money than Lila probably saw in 2 months. Even if she could somehow scrape together the entry fee, she'd be riding against women who'd been around horses their entire lives, many of whom had been competing in rodeos since they were children. "I don't have the entry fee," Lila said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Oh, we'll take care of that," Buster said with obvious delight. "Won't we, boys? $50 is a small price to pay for entertainment." "Entertainment," Lila repeated, and there was something dangerous in the way she said it. Tommy either didn't hear the warning in her voice or chose to ignore it. "Best entertainment Cedar Ridge has seen in years. Don't you think so, Jake? Better than the time old Peterson's bull got loose during the church social." Jake agreed with a grin. Hank had heard enough. The memory of Martha's voice echoed in his head, as clear as if she were standing beside him. Stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. He'd failed to act too many times in recent months. Let his grief and isolation become excuses for avoiding the kind of involvement that defined a man's character. But watching 3 young men gang up on a girl who had no one to defend her stirred something in him that had been dormant for too long. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the fence with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching on the gravel drive, loud enough to announce his approach. The 4 figures by the road turned toward him, and Hank could see the surprise and calculation in the young men's faces as they tried to figure out how much of their conversation he'd overheard. "Morning, boys?" Hank said pleasantly, nodding to each of them in turn. "Lila." "Morning, Mr. McCall," Tommy replied, his tone carefully respectful. "We were just discussing the upcoming rodeo with your neighbor here." "I heard," Hank said, coming to a stop about 10 feet away from the group. Close enough to be part of the conversation, far enough to avoid seeming confrontational. "Sounds like quite an interesting discussion." The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Lila's eyes had found his, and he could see a mix of hope and wariness in her expression. She'd been around long enough to know that adults didn't always intervene on behalf of children, especially children who weren't their responsibility. "If she wants to ride," Hank said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be argued out of it, "she'll ride. But she'll do it proper." The words surprised him almost as much as they surprised the others. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even realized he'd made a decision until the words were out of his mouth. But there they were, hanging in the morning air like a challenge that couldn't be taken back. Tommy's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and finally something that might have been respect. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about horses," Hank replied. "If this young lady wants to learn to ride well enough to compete, I'll teach her. But understand this, if I'm training her, she'll be ready. And that means you boys better be ready too." The implication was clear enough. This wouldn't be the humiliating spectacle they'd been anticipating. This would be real competition, with real stakes and real consequences for everyone involved. Buster was the first to recover his voice. "You're talking about 3 weeks, Mr. McCall. 3 weeks to turn someone who's never been on a horse into a bronc rider." "I've done more with less time," Hank said quietly. "Question is whether she's got the heart for it." He looked directly at Lila, seeing something in her dark eyes that reminded him powerfully of Sarah at her most determined. "What do you say, girl? You interested in learning to ride proper, or you just want to keep watching from the fence?" Lila's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady and sure. "I'm interested," and with those 2 words, Hank McCall found himself committed to something that would change all their lives in ways none of them could possibly anticipate. Hank spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering what had possessed him to make such a rash promise. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, he'd replayed the scene by the fence a dozen times, each replay making him more certain that he'd let his emotions override his common sense. 3 weeks to turn a complete novice into a competitive bronc rider wasn't just ambitious, it was potentially dangerous. But when Lila appeared at his front gate just after sunrise, canvas bag slung over her shoulder and determination written in every line of her posture, Hank knew there was no backing out. She'd taken him at his word, trusted him enough to show up when he could have easily rationalized his way out of the commitment overnight. That kind of faith deserved better than a man's second thoughts. "You're early," he called out as he walked toward the gate, coffee mug in hand. "Figured we had a lot of work to do," she replied simply. "Didn't want to waste daylight." Hank studied her face, looking for signs of doubt or hesitation that might give him an excuse to reconsider. Instead, he saw the kind of quiet resolve that reminded him of Martha in her best moments, when she decided something needed doing, and nothing in the world was going to stop her from seeing it through. "You understand what you're getting into here?" he asked. "Bronc riding isn't like the trail riding most folks picture when they think about horses. These animals are specifically chosen because they don't want to be ridden. They're going to do everything in their power to put you on the ground, and they're going to do it hard and fast." "I understand." "Do you? Because there's no shame in changing your mind. Those boys were having fun at your expense, but that doesn't mean you have to prove anything to them." Lila shifted her weight slightly, and for a moment Hank thought she might take the out he was offering. Then she looked up at him with eyes that held more steel than any 14-year-old should need to develop. "It's not about proving anything to them," she said quietly. "It's about proving something to myself." Something in her voice convinced him that arguing would be pointless. Whatever drove this girl ran deeper than wounded pride or teenage rebellion. She had the look of someone who'd been carrying a burden for too long and had finally found a chance to set it down. "All right then," Hank said, opening the gate. "Let's see what you know." He led her to the barn, pulling Sarah's old childhood saddle from its hook on the wall where it had hung undisturbed for the better part of 15 years. The leather was dry but still supple, the silver conchos tarnished but intact. Sarah had won her first ribbon on this saddle. back when she was 8 years old and determined to follow in her parents' footsteps. This was my daughter's, Hank explained, running his hand over the worn pommel. She outgrew it when she was about your size. Lila touched the saddle reverently, her fingers tracing the tooled patterns in the leather. It's beautiful. She must have loved it. She did for a while. Hank lifted the saddle and carried it toward the corral, where Buttercup, his gentlest mare, waited with the patience that came from 20 years of dealing with nervous beginners. Before she decided horses were just another part of the life she wanted to leave behind. He hadn't meant for the bitterness to creep into his voice, but Lila caught it anyway. Her eyes found his, with an understanding that seemed too mature for her years. Sometimes people have to go away to figure out what they really want, she said softly. Doesn't mean they don't love what they're leaving. The observation was so astute, so gently delivered, that Hank felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of resentment towards Sarah that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. This girl had a way of seeing straight to the heart of things that most adults spent decades learning to avoid. Maybe so, he said, settling the saddle on Buttercup's back. Right now, though, let's focus on what you want. You ever been on a horse before? A few times. Nothing serious. Define nothing serious. Lila's cheeks colored slightly. Trail rides at a summer camp when I was younger. The kind where they lead you around in circles and tell you not to be afraid. Better than nothing, Hank said, though privately he wondered if those supervised trail rides might have actually been worse than no experience at all. Trail riding taught you to be a passenger, not a partner. It was the difference between sitting in a car and actually driving one. What I'm going to teach you isn't about following someone else's lead. It's about communicating with an animal that has its own ideas about how things should go. He spent the next hour going over basics that most people never bothered to learn properly. How to approach a horse, how to read their body language, how to project calm confidence even when you felt anything but confident yourself. Lila absorbed every word with the intensity of someone memorizing a map of unfamiliar territory, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond the immediate lesson to its practical applications. When she finally settled into Sarah's old saddle, her posture was awkward but not hopeless. She had the long legs and strong core that made for natural balance, and more importantly, she had the kind of relaxed alertness that good riders developed over time. Some people fought the horse's movement, tensing up and making both rider and animal miserable in the process. Lila seemed to understand instinctively that riding was about working with the horse's rhythm rather than against it. How does it feel? Hank asked, leading Buttercup around the corral at a slow walk. Like coming home, Lila said, then immediately looked embarrassed by the admission. I mean, it feels natural. More natural than I expected, Hank nodded, unsurprised. He'd suspected as much from watching her study his horses from the fence line. Some people had an affinity for animals that went beyond learned skills, a kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught, only recognized and nurtured. They worked for another hour, progressing from a walk to a trot as Lila's confidence grew. She fell off twice, both times managing to land without injury and climb back on without complaint. The second time, she was actually laughing as she dusted herself off, exhilarated rather than discouraged by the tumble. That's enough for today, Hank said finally, though part of him wanted to keep going. For the first time in months, he'd felt genuinely engaged in something beyond the basic requirements of survival. Teaching Lila reminded him why he'd fallen in love with training. Horses in the first place, the satisfaction of seeing someone discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed as they unsaddled. Buttercup and put away the gear, Lila worked with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was memorizing every step of the process. She asked about proper grooming techniques, about reading a horse's mood from their ears and stance, about the difference between various types of bits and their effects on communication between horse and rider. You've got good instincts, Hank told her as they finished brushing down the mare. Better than most people who've been around horses their whole lives. Thank you for giving me the chance to find out, Lila replied. I know you didn't have to do this, Hank considered that as he watched her walk back toward town, moving with the slightly bow-legged gait of someone who'd spent time in the saddle. He supposed he could have walked away from the confrontation at the fence, minded his own business, and let the chips fall where they may. But something about the girl's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had stirred memories of the man he used to be. The kind of man Martha had married, who believed that standing up for others was part of what separated decent people from the rest. For the first time since Martha's funeral, Hank found himself looking forward to tomorrow, not because the daily routine had suddenly become more bearable, but because he had something meaningful to do with his time. Someone was counting on him again, trusting him to keep his word and help her become something more than circumstance had originally allowed. As he headed back to the house, Hank caught himself humming, an old song Martha used to sing while she worked in her garden. The sound surprised him so much that he stopped mid-note, looking around as if someone might have heard and commented on this first sign that the grief was beginning to loosen its grip. Maybe teaching Lila to ride would prove impossible in the time they had. Maybe the whole enterprise would end in embarrassment or injury, or both. But for the first time in 5 years, Hank McCall had reason to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. And that felt like the beginning of something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. The training intensified over the next few days, each session revealing more of Lila's remarkable natural ability. What had started as basic horsemanship lessons quickly evolved into something more sophisticated, as it became clear that the girl's instincts were far ahead of her experience. She seemed to anticipate what the horses were going to do before they did it, adjusting her weight and position in ways that suggested she was reading signals most people never learned to recognize. By the end of the first week, she was handling horses that would have challenged riders with years of experience. Hank found himself pushing her harder than he'd initially planned, not because he was impatient, but because she was clearly capable of more than either of them had expected. Her progress was so rapid that it forced him to revise his entire approach to the training. "You're picking this up faster than anyone has a right to," he told her during a break between sessions, watching as she cooled down Ranger, a spirited gelding who'd given 3 previous students more trouble than they could handle. "Makes me wonder if you've been holding out on me about your experience." Lila stroked Ranger's neck with the kind of automatic affection that came from genuine connection rather than learned technique. "I told you the truth about the trail rides, but I've been around horses before, in other ways." She paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. Hank waited, recognizing the careful calculation that preceded any personal disclosure from someone who'd learned to guard their history. "When I was younger, maybe 10 or 11, I lived with the family outside Casper for about 8 months. The Hendersons. They had a small ranch, nothing fancy, but they raised quarter horses for rodeo stock. I wasn't allowed to ride. They said I was too small, and they couldn't risk the liability. But I spent every free minute watching and learning." "What happened? Why didn't you stay?" The question was out before Hank could think better of it, and he saw Lila's expression close down slightly. He'd pushed too hard, crossed a line she wasn't ready to discuss. "Things change," she said simply. "Foster situations don't always work out, no matter how much everyone wants them to." The pain in her voice was carefully controlled, but it was there nonetheless. Hank recognized the tone of someone who'd learned not to expect permanence, who'd trained themselves not to get too attached to any situation, because attachment only made the inevitable departures more difficult. "I'm sorry," he said. "That must have been hard." Lila shrugged, but there was nothing casual about the gesture. "Taught me to pay attention while I had the chance, to learn what I could, while I could." The conversation shifted something between them, deepened the connection in a way that went beyond teacher and student. Hank found himself thinking about the girl's situation more than was probably wise, wondering about the circumstances that had led her to Cedar Ridge and the reasons she'd chosen to stay in an abandoned barn rather than seek more conventional help. He started making subtle changes to their routine, small kindnesses that he told himself were just practical considerations. When she arrived for morning sessions, there was always coffee ready and a plate of whatever he'd fixed for breakfast. When the weather turned cold during an afternoon lesson, he made sure there was a jacket she could borrow hanging in the barn. When he noticed her boots were wearing thin and would soon be unsafe around the horses, a new pair appeared on the tackroom bench with a note saying they'd been ordered for someone else who'd changed their mind. Lila accepted these gestures with the careful grace of someone who understood the difference between charity and kindness, never mentioning them directly, but showing her appreciation in the way she listened more intently to his instruction, worked harder during their sessions, and took extra care with the equipment and animals he was trusting to her inexperienced hands. It was during one of these extended training sessions that Hank discovered Martha's old recipe box in the kitchen, buried behind a stack of veterinary supplies he'd been meaning to organize for months. He'd been looking for something to occupy his hands while he thought about how to approach Lila's next lesson, and opening the familiar wooden box brought back a flood of memories. Martha's neat handwriting covered dozens of index cards, recipes for everything, from Sunday dinner pot roast to the molasses cookies that had been Sarah's favorite childhood treat. But it wasn't the food that caught his attention so much as the memories associated with each recipe. The care Martha had taken in feeding the people she loved, the way she'd used cooking as another form of nurturing. That evening, for the first time since Martha's death, Hank found himself actually cooking rather than just heating up canned soup or making another sandwich. He worked his way through Martha's recipe for beef stew, following her precise instructions and trying to remember the way she'd moved around the kitchen with such confident efficiency. The result wasn't quite the same. He could never seem to get the seasoning exactly right, but it was recognizably the dish he remembered. When Lila arrived for the next morning's session, he had a thermos of the stew waiting along with the usual coffee and biscuits. "You don't have to feed me," she said. But her eyes betrayed her hunger and her gratitude. "Martha always said the best way to start a hard day was with a full stomach," Hank replied. Seemed like she might have been onto something. They ate in companionable silence, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. It struck Hank that this was the first time in years he'd shared breakfast with someone. The first time the kitchen had felt like something other than a necessary stop between sleep and work. "Tell me about her," Lila said quietly. "About Martha, I mean. If you don't mind talking about her." Hank considered the question, surprised to find that the prospect of sharing Martha's memory didn't bring the familiar stab of pain he'd learned to expect. Instead, there was something almost healing about the idea of helping someone else understand what Martha had been like, of making sure her influence extended beyond the boundaries of his own grief. She was the kind of person who made everything better just by being there, he said finally. Not because she was perfect. Lord knows she had her stubborn moments, but because she had this way of seeing the best in people and situations, even when the best wasn't immediately obvious, like you're doing with me, Lila observed. The comment caught Hank off guard, made him realize that somewhere in the process of teaching Lila to ride, he'd begun to see her not as a project or an obligation, but as someone whose success mattered to him personally. The protective instincts he'd felt during the confrontation with the ranch hands had evolved into something deeper, not quite paternal, but heading in that direction. "Maybe," he admitted. "Though I think Martha would say you're making it pretty easy to see the best in you." They finished breakfast and moved to the training corral, where Hank introduced Lila to Dakota, a mare with enough spirit to challenge her growing skills without being dangerous. As he watched her work through the more complex maneuvers he was beginning to teach her, Hank realized that something fundamental had shifted in his daily routine. For the first time since Martha's death, he was looking forward to each day not just as something to endure, but as an opportunity to be part of someone else's growth and discovery. Teaching Lila was reminding him of who he used to be, not just as a horseman, but as a man who believed his actions could make a positive difference in the world. The ranch felt less empty now. filled with purpose and possibility in ways he'd almost forgotten were possible. And in the back of his mind, he could almost hear Martha's approving laughter, the sound she'd always made when she caught him doing something kind that he was trying to pretend was merely practical. Maybe this strange partnership would end badly. Maybe 3 weeks wasn't enough time to prepare Lila for the kind of competition she'd be facing. But for now, in this moment, watching her move with increasing confidence and grace, Hank allowed himself to believe that some risks were worth taking, and that sometimes the most important victories had nothing to do with winning or losing, and everything to do with discovering what you were capable of becoming. 2 weeks until the rodeo, and the reality of what they were attempting had begun to settle over Cedar Ridge, like dust after a windstorm. Word had spread through the community with the efficiency that only small-town gossip could achieve. Hank McCall was training the orphan girl to ride in the ladies' bronc competition, and opinion was divided about whether this represented admirable community spirit or dangerous foolishness. The training had reached a new level of intensity. Lila was now working with horses that had genuine rodeo experience, animals that knew the difference between a practice session and the real thing. She'd graduated from Dakota to Thunder, a black gelding with a reputation for creative bucking patterns that had unseated more than one experienced rider. The fact that she could stay mounted for the full 8 seconds required for a qualifying ride was impressive. The fact that she was beginning to make it look easy was something approaching miraculous. But success in the practice corral had drawn unwanted attention. Tommy Brennan and his friends had taken to showing up during training sessions, ostensibly to check on their investment in Lila's entry fee, but actually to assess whether their intended humiliation might backfire into genuine competition. What they saw clearly made them uncomfortable. "She's got talent. I'll give her that," Tommy admitted to Hank during one of these visits, his tone carrying a grudging respect that hadn't been there 2 weeks earlier. "But talent's only part of it. There's a difference between riding in your own corral and riding in front of 500 people with everything on the line." "True enough," Hank agreed, not mentioning that he'd been thinking the same thing. Lila's progress had exceeded his most optimistic expectations, but competition was about more than skill. It was about handling pressure, about maintaining focus when everything around you was noise and chaos and adrenaline. Tommy shifted his weight, and Hank caught something in his expression that suggested this conversation wasn't as casual as it appeared. The young man was studying Lila with the intensity of someone trying to solve a problem, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like recognition. "Can I ask you something, Mr. McCall?" "Shoot! Where exactly did she come from?" "The girl, I mean. May says she just showed up one day, but people don't just appear out of nowhere. Everyone comes from somewhere." It was a fair question, one that Hank had been wondering about himself. Lila had shared pieces of her history, the Foster families, the brief time with the Hendersons, but she'd been careful to avoid specifics about dates and locations, about the sequence of events that had brought her to Cedar Ridge. "Why do you ask?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, watching Lila work Thunder through a series of increasingly difficult maneuvers. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing something significant. "My father kept records. Every rodeo he ever competed in, every rider he ever faced, every horse he ever rode. Box after box of programs and photographs and newspaper clippings, all organized by year and location. It's like he was trying to document the whole history of rodeo in Wyoming and Colorado." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I was going through some of his old stuff last week, looking for pictures for a memorial display the rodeo committee wants to set up, and I found something interesting. A program from a rodeo in Casper about 4 years ago. One of the featured riders was a man named Jake Morrison. Different Jake than our Jake, obviously. This one was older, probably 40-something, and he was listed as riding for the Henderson Ranch." Hank felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Henderson Ranch, the same family Lila had mentioned during one of their conversations. The people who'd taken her in, but hadn't let her ride because of liability concerns. Jake Morrison died in a riding accident that year, Tommy continued. Bad fall during a bull riding event. The program mentioned that he was survived by a pregnant girlfriend, but it didn't give her name or say what happened to her after he died. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke. Hank found himself looking at Lila with new eyes, searching her features for resemblances he might have missed, counting backward through the years to see if the timeline made sense. I think there's more to her story than she's told anyone, Tommy said quietly. And I think maybe she doesn't know all of it herself. That evening, after Lila had headed back to her makeshift shelter in the abandoned barn, Hank sat on his front porch with a beer he didn't really want and tried to process what Tommy had shared with him. If the young man's suspicions were correct, if Lila was indeed Jake Morrison's daughter, then her natural ability with horses made perfect sense. Rodeo talent often ran in families, passed down through generations like any other genetic gift, but it also meant she'd been living in ignorance of her own heritage, unaware that the skill she was discovering might be her birthright, rather than just unexpected aptitude. It meant the Hendersons had taken in the daughter of a man who'd worked for them, without telling her about the connection. It meant she had roots in the rodeo community that went deeper than anyone had realized. The ethical question was whether to share this information with her. On one hand, she deserved to know about her father, to understand that her love of horses and natural riding ability came from something more substantial than childhood observation. On the other hand, learning that the people who'd cared for her had withheld such crucial information might be more hurtful than helpful, especially when she was already dealing with the pressure of the upcoming competition. Hank was still wrestling with the decision when headlights swept across his driveway and Doc Peterson's familiar pickup truck pulled up to the house. The old doctor climbed out with the careful movements of someone whose joints reminded him daily of 70-plus years of living, and walked up to the porch with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission. "Evening, Hank. Mind if I join you for a minute?" "Help yourself," Hank replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Beer's cold if you want one." "Don't mind if I do." Doc Peterson settled into the chair with a small grunt of satisfaction. "Been a long day. Delivered the Morrison baby, little Jake's second boy, and stitched up 3 different cowboys who thought they were younger than they actually are." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. 2 men who'd known each other long enough that conversation wasn't always necessary. Finally, Doc Peterson cleared his throat in the way that usually preceded something important. "I wanted to talk to you about the girl." "About Lila? What about her?" "I'm concerned you might be setting her up for more than disappointment. Bronc riding isn't just dangerous for inexperienced riders. It's dangerous for everyone who tries it. I've patched up more cowboys than I care to count, and some of them had been riding since before they could properly walk." Hank had been expecting this conversation, had been surprised it had taken this long for someone to voice the concerns that were probably on everyone's mind. "She's good, Doc. Better than good. Better than most people I've trained. I don't doubt that. But being good in practice and being good under pressure are 2 different things entirely. And if something goes wrong, if she gets hurt badly, it won't just be her that suffers. This whole community will feel responsible, and you'll carry the guilt for the rest of your life." The words stung because there was truth in them. Hank had been so focused on Lila's progress, so caught up in the satisfaction of seeing her develop skills he'd never expected her to possess, that he hadn't fully considered the consequences of failure. Not just the embarrassment of a poor performance, but the very real possibility of serious injury. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Tell her she can't compete after she's worked this hard? Break a promise I made in front of half the town? I'd have you make sure she understands what she's getting into. Make sure she's competing because she wants to, not because she feels like she has to prove something to those boys who started this whole mess." Doc Peterson finished his beer and stood up, his point made and his conscience clear. "Just remember, Hank, sometimes the most caring thing you can do for someone is help them walk away from something that might destroy them, even if they don't want to hear it." After the doctor left, Hank remained on the porch long into the night, wrestling with doubts that felt heavier now that they'd been voiced by someone whose judgment he respected. Tomorrow would bring another training session, another day of watching Lila push herself to master skills that had taken him decades to fully understand. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Tommy Brennan's revelation about Jake Morrison waited like a loaded gun, ready to change everything depending on how and when Hank chose to use it. 1 week before the rodeo, the weight of secrets had become almost unbearable. Hank watched Lila work with increasing skill and confidence, knowing that each successful ride was built on a foundation she didn't fully understand. The question of her father's identity had become a constant presence in his thoughts, making every training session feel like a conversation, where half the important words were left unspoken. The decision was taken out of his hands during what should have been a routine morning session. Lila was working on her dismount timing, practicing the graceful exit that separated competent riders from spectacular ones, when her canvas bag caught on the fence post and tore open, scattering its meager contents across the dusty ground of the corral. She scrambled to collect her belongings, a few pieces of clothing, a small Bible with a worn leather cover, some toiletries, and other essentials that represented everything she owned in the world. But it was the photograph that caught Hank's attention, a torn and faded picture that had been folded and refolded so many times, the creases had become white lines across the image. "Sorry," Lila said quickly, reaching for the photograph. "I'll just wait," Hank said gently, kneeling beside her.
"May I?"
She hesitated, then nodded, understanding that this moment represented some kind of crossroads in their relationship. Hank picked up the photograph carefully, smoothing out the worst of the wrinkles, and found himself looking at a face he recognized from Tommy Brennan's description and his own distant memories. The man in the picture was in his early 30s, wearing the distinctive shirt and hat of a professional rodeo competitor. He had Lila's dark eyes and the same strong jawline, the same way of holding his shoulders that suggested confidence without arrogance. More telling still was the way he sat his horse, with the same natural grace that Hank had been watching Lila develop over the past 2 weeks. "This is your father," Hank said quietly. It wasn't a question. Lila's composure cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerability she usually kept so carefully hidden. "I think so. It's the only picture I have, and it's not even complete. It got torn years ago when I was younger and didn't know to be more careful with it." Hank studied the image more closely, noting the partial letters visible on the man's shirt, the distinctive architecture in the background that he now recognized as the Casper Rodeo grounds. Everything Tommy had told him was falling into place with the clarity of a puzzle whose final pieces had suddenly been found. "His name was Jake Morrison," Hank said, and watched Lila's eyes widen with shock and hope and a dozen other emotions that seemed to war across her face. "You knew him?" "Not personally, but I knew of him. He was a champion bronc rider, one of the best in the region. He competed all over Wyoming and Colorado, rode for several different ranches over the years." Lila clutched the photograph against her chest, as if it might disappear if she didn't hold it tight enough. "I never knew his name. The people who took care of me after my mother died, they said she never talked about him. They said she was too sick near the end to tell them much of anything." The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, the sound of someone who'd spent years wondering about half of her own identity. Hank felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, not just for her physical safety during the upcoming competition, but for her emotional well-being as she processed this information. "There's more you should know," he said carefully. "Your father died in a riding accident about 4 years ago. He was competing in a bull riding event in Casper when it happened." Lila was quiet for a long time, processing the confirmation of what she'd probably always suspected, but never known for certain. When she spoke, her voice was steady but thick with unshed tears. "So I'm an orphan because both my parents loved horses too much to be safe around them." The observation was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of self-pity, that Hank felt his heart break a little for this girl who'd learned to carry grief with such dignity. "Your father wasn't reckless," he said. "Jake Morrison had a reputation for being smart about the risks he took. Sometimes accidents just happen, no matter how careful you are or how skilled you've become. Like what might happen to me next week." There it was, the fear that had been lurking beneath all her determination, finally voiced aloud. Hank realized that Lila understood the dangers of bronc riding better than anyone had given her credit for. She wasn't competing out of naive enthusiasm or teenage bravado. She was making an informed choice to follow in her father's footsteps, despite knowing exactly what those footsteps had ultimately led to. "Is that why you wanted to learn to ride?" he asked. "Because you knew it was in your blood?" "I wanted to learn because it felt like home," Lila said simply. "Like the person I was supposed to be was waiting for me every time I got near a horse." Finding out about my father just explains why it felt that way. They spent the rest of the session working in companionable silence, both of them processing the implications of what had been revealed. Hank found himself watching Lila with new eyes, seeing not just her natural ability, but the genetic legacy that had shaped it. Every move she made in the saddle seemed to echo her father's remembered grace, as if Jake Morrison's expertise had somehow survived his death and found expression through his daughter's inherited talent. That afternoon, Tommy Brennan appeared at the ranch alone, without his usual companions. His expression was serious as he approached the corral, where Hank was adjusting some equipment. "I heard you, and Lila had a conversation about her father," he said without preamble. "Word travels fast. It does when it matters. I wanted to apologize for not saying something sooner. I've been carrying this information around for days, trying to figure out if it was my place to share it." Hank studied the young man's face, seeing a maturity there that hadn't been present when this whole situation began. The cruel boy who'd thought it would be funny to embarrass an orphan girl had evolved into someone capable of genuine concern for her well-being. "Why did you finally decide to share it?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his answer carefully. "Because I realized that if I was wrong about who she was, I'd just be spreading gossip. But if I was right and didn't say anything, I'd be robbing her of the chance to know her own heritage. That seemed like the worst choice. And now that she knows, now I'm scared for her in a different way. Before, I was worried she'd embarrass herself trying to do something she wasn't capable of. Now I'm worried she'll feel like she has to live up to her father's reputation, even if it kills her." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Hank had been thinking the same thing as he watched Lila process the information about Jake Morrison. There was a difference between riding to prove you could do it and riding to honor a dead parent's memory. The second motivation carried emotional weight that could either inspire greatness or lead to the kind of dangerous overreaching that ended badly. "She's stronger than you think," Hank said. Though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. Maybe, but strength isn't always enough. Sometimes it's the strongest ones who push themselves too hard, who can't admit when they've reached their limits. Tommy kicked at a clod of dirt with the toe of his boot, his expression troubled. "I want you to know that Jake and Buster and we're not going to make this harder for her than it already is. Whatever happens next week, we're not going to be part of the problem." It was as close to an apology as Hank was likely to get from someone Tommy's age, and he recognized the significance of the gesture. The young man who'd started this whole situation with a cruel dare had developed enough self-awareness to understand the consequences of his actions, and enough maturity to try to make amends. "I appreciate that," Hank said. "She's going to need all the support she can get." As Tommy walked back toward town, Hank found himself thinking about the strange ways life connected people across time and circumstances. Jake Morrison had died before he could meet his daughter, but his legacy lived on in her hands and seat, an instinctive understanding of how to move with a horse rather than against it. The Hendersons had cared for her without telling her about her father, probably trying to protect her from the pain of learning about another loss. And now, with less than a week until the rodeo, all of these hidden connections were finally coming to light. Whether that knowledge would help or hurt her performance remained to be seen. But as Hank watched Lila work through her final preparations, He couldn't shake the feeling that she was riding not just for herself now, but for the father she'd never known and the legacy she was only beginning to understand. 3 days before the rodeo, Hank was adjusting Thunder's tack for what he hoped would be Lila's final major practice session when he heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive car navigating his gravel driveway. He looked up to see a gleaming silver sedan pulling up to the house, its city-clean finish and Denver license plates as out of place in his rural setting as a diamond ring in a feed trough. The driver's door opened, and Sarah stepped out, her appearance immediately confirming what Hank had suspected but hoped he wouldn't have to face quite so soon. His daughter looked every inch the successful urban professional in her tailored suit and practical but elegant shoes, her dark hair styled in a way that suggested both competence and approachability. Behind her, a second figure emerged from the passenger side, a man in his early 30s wearing the kind of casual clothes that probably cost more than most people in Cedar Ridge spent on their entire wardrobe. Sarah's eyes found him immediately, and Hank felt his stomach tighten at the expression he saw there. This wasn't a social visit. This was an intervention. "Dad," she said, walking toward him with the determined stride of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation during the entire drive from Denver. "We need to talk." "Sarah." He set down the curry comb he'd been using and tried to project a calm he didn't feel. "This is unexpected. Good to see you, is it?" There was an edge to her voice that reminded him uncomfortably of Martha during their worst arguments, the same carefully controlled tone that suggested deeper emotions, being held in check through sheer force of will. "Because I'm getting some very concerning reports about what you've been up to lately." The man behind her cleared his throat politely, and Sarah turned back with what looked like an effort to remember her manners. "Dad, this is David Chen, my fiancé." "David, my father." David stepped forward, with his hand extended and a smile that managed to be both genuine and nervous. "Mr. McCall, it's good to finally meet you. Sarah's told me so much about you and the ranch." Hank shook the offered hand, noting the softness that came from office work and the way David's eyes kept darting around the ranch with the slightly overwhelmed look of someone completely out of their element. "David," Hank acknowledged. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge. Though I'm guessing this isn't exactly a pleasure trip." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "No, it's not. Dad, what exactly do you think you're doing with this girl?" Before Hank could answer, Lila appeared around the corner of the barn, leading Thunder by his halter. She moved with the confident ease that had developed over their weeks of training, but Hank could see her taking in the situation, the expensive car, the well-dressed strangers, the tension radiating from every line of Sarah's posture. "Mr. McCall." Lila's voice was carefully neutral. "Should I put Thunder back in his stall?" "No, we're still planning to work this afternoon," Hank said, then hesitated as he realized the awkwardness of the situation. "Lila, I'd like you to meet my daughter Sarah and her fiancé David." "Sarah, David, this is Lila." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken judgments and competing loyalties. Sarah studied Lila with the kind of professional assessment that came from years of evaluating people quickly and accurately. David offered a polite nod, but seemed uncertain how to interact with a teenager covered in barn dust and wearing clothes that had seen better years. "So you're the one who's got my father playing mentor," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone that made Lila's shoulders stiffen almost imperceptibly. "Sarah," Hank warned, recognizing the danger signs. "What?" "I'm not allowed to be concerned when I hear that my 60-year-old father has suddenly taken responsibility for training a complete stranger to do something that could get her killed. When I find out he's more invested in some girl he's known for 3 weeks than he's been in his own family for the past 5 years." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Hank felt the familiar weight of guilt settle over him. Guilt over the phone calls he hadn't returned, the visits he'd discouraged, the emotional distance he'd maintained since Martha's death. But beneath the guilt was a flare of anger at having his motivations questioned, especially in front of Lila. "That's enough," he said quietly. "No, it's not nearly enough." Do you have any idea what it's been like for me, Dad? Watching you disappear into yourself after Mom died, barely acknowledging that I exist, except when I force the issue by showing up unannounced? David stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Maybe we should discuss this privately. There's nothing private about it, Sarah continued, her voice rising slightly. He's been living like a hermit for 5 years, acting like he's the only one who lost someone important. And now, suddenly, he's willing to invest time and energy in a stranger's future when he couldn't be bothered to care about his own daughter's wedding plans. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Hank realized that Sarah wasn't just angry about Lila. She was angry about everything that had gone unspoken between them since Martha's funeral. All the phone calls that had grown shorter and more stilted over time. All the visits she'd suggested that he'd found excuses to avoid. All the ways he'd allowed his grief to build walls between himself and the one family member he had left. "You're right," he said finally, the admission costing him more than he'd expected. "I haven't been much of a father to you these past few years." Sarah's anger wavered, replaced by something that looked like relief mixed with pain. "I didn't come here to fight with you, Dad. I came because I'm worried about you. And I'm worried about what happens to her." She nodded toward Lila. "If this goes wrong," Lila had been listening to this exchange with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned to make themselves invisible during adult conflicts. Now she stepped forward slightly, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "I can speak for myself," she said quietly. "And I can make my own decisions about what risks are worth taking." Sarah turned to look at her more carefully, seeming to really see her for the first time. "You're 14 years old. You don't have enough life experience to understand what you're risking." "I understand more than you think," Lila replied, and there was steel in her voice that reminded Hank powerfully of Martha during her most determined moments. "I understand that your father has given me something no one else has been willing to give me, a chance to find out what I'm capable of. And I understand that whether I succeed or fail, it'll be because of my own choices, not because someone else decided what was best for me." David cleared his throat again, more assertively this time. "Look, I don't pretend to understand all the dynamics here, but Sarah and I didn't drive 5 hours to create more problems. We came because we care about Mr. McCall and want to make sure everyone's making informed decisions." "What kind of decisions?" Hank asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box, holding it out toward him with an expression that mixed hope and determination. "David proposed last month. We're getting married in October, and we want you there, Dad. But more than that, we want you to be part of our lives going forward. David's been offered a position with a firm that has offices in Colorado Springs. It's only 3 hours from Denver. Much closer than we are now." She opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant engagement ring that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in tiny. "Sparkles, we've been talking about buying a house with some land. Maybe even getting a few horses. Somewhere you could visit regularly, or even—" She paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "Even live if you wanted to. If you were ready to sell this place and start over somewhere new." The offer was generous, clearly well-intentioned, and represented everything Hank should have wanted. A chance to rebuild his relationship with his daughter, to be part of her new family, to leave behind the ranch that had become more museum than home. But as he looked at the ring sparkling in Sarah's outstretched hand, all he could think about was Lila's face 3 weeks ago when she'd agreed to learn to ride. The way hope had kindled in her dark eyes for the first time since he'd known her. He thought about the mornings they'd shared over breakfast, the satisfaction of watching her discover capabilities she'd never known she possessed, the sense of purpose that had begun to fill the empty spaces Martha's death had left behind. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I appreciate what you're offering, more than you know, but I can't walk away from Lila right now, not when she's worked this hard. Not when she's finally found something that makes her feel connected to her father's memory." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: hurt, frustration, and finally something that looked almost like betrayal. "So that's it? You choose her over your own family?" "It's not about choosing," Hank said, though even as he spoke the words he wasn't sure they were entirely true. "It's about honoring commitments, about not abandoning people who are counting on you." The irony of his words wasn't lost on any of them. Sarah's expression made it clear that she understood exactly what he'd failed to do for her over the past 5 years, and how that failure had led to this moment where he was prioritizing a stranger's needs over his daughter's desire for reconciliation. David stepped forward, clearly trying to salvage what was rapidly becoming a disaster. "Maybe there's a middle ground here. Maybe after the rodeo, we could all sit down and figure out a way forward that works for everyone." But Sarah was already shaking her head, closing the ring box with a sharp snap that sounded unnaturally loud in the ranch yard. "No," she said, her voice tight with hurt and disappointment. "I've spent 5 years trying to find a middle ground with him. David, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life competing with his guilt projects for attention." She turned back to Hank, and he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, despite her attempt to maintain composure. "When you're ready to remember that you have a daughter who needs you, call me. But don't expect me to keep making excuses for why you can't be bothered to prioritize your own family." The words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. But beneath the pain was a recognition that Sarah wasn't entirely wrong, that somewhere in the process of helping Lila, he'd found it easier to invest in her future than to deal with the complicated emotions surrounding his relationship with his own daughter. As Sarah and David climbed back into their car and drove away, leaving dust and unresolved tension in their wake, Hank found himself standing between two responsibilities that suddenly felt mutually exclusive. On one side was Lila, who needed his support and expertise to compete safely in 3 days. On the other was Sarah, who'd finally worked up the courage to ask for the kind of relationship he'd been avoiding since Martha's death. "I'm sorry," Lila said quietly, and Hank realized she'd been standing silently beside Thunder throughout the entire confrontation. "I didn't mean to cause problems with your family." "You didn't cause anything," Hank replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "This has been building for years," but as he watched the silver sedan disappear down the road toward town, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a choice that would have consequences far beyond the upcoming rodeo. And for the first time since he'd committed to training Lila, he wondered if the cost of keeping his promise might be higher than any of them were prepared to pay. The day before the rodeo dawned gray and heavy with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms, the kind of weather that made horses skittish and riders second-guess their timing. Hank stood at his kitchen window, watching the distant mountains disappear behind a wall of clouds, and felt the weight of everything that had gone unsaid pressing down on him like the approaching storm. Sarah and David had checked into the Cedar Ridge Inn the night before. He'd heard from May, who'd heard from her sister who worked the front desk, but they hadn't attempted to contact him. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have, loaded with disappointment and missed opportunities that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Lila arrived for what would be their final training session, carrying herself differently than she had in weeks past. The confidence that had been building steadily since their first lesson remained, but it was tempered now with something that looked like resignation. She moved through the familiar routine of saddling Thunder with mechanical precision, her usual questions about technique and strategy, replaced by a quietness that worried Hank more than any amount of pre-competition nerves would have. "You're having second thoughts," he observed, as she adjusted the girth strap with hands that were steadier than his own. "About the riding?" "No." Lila's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "About whether it's worth what it's costing you." There it was. The conversation Hank had been dreading since Sarah's car had disappeared down his driveway. He'd hoped Lila might not have fully grasped the implications of what she'd witnessed, but he should have known better. The girl who'd survived foster care and months of living rough had learned to read adult conflicts with the kind of accuracy that came from needing to predict when situations might turn. Dangerous. That's not your decision to make, Hank said gently. Isn't it? Lila paused in her preparations and looked at him directly, her dark eyes holding a maturity that still surprised him despite their weeks together. You've given me something incredible these past 3 weeks. Not just the riding lessons, but the feeling that someone believes in me, that someone thinks I'm worth investing in. I won't let that gift destroy your relationship with your daughter. The words were delivered with such quiet dignity that Hank felt something break open in his chest. Here was a 14-year-old girl, someone who'd had precious little kindness shown to her by the world, willing to sacrifice her dreams to protect him from consequences he'd brought on himself. Lila, I've already made up my mind, she continued, beginning to remove Thunder's saddle with the same careful efficiency she'd used to put it on. I'm withdrawing from the competition. You can tell people I got scared, or that I wasn't ready, or whatever explanation makes the most sense. But I won't be the reason you lose your family. The saddle slipped from her hands and hit the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Hank watched her shoulders shake once, a barely perceptible tremor that revealed how much this decision was costing her, before she regained control and began unbuckling Thunder's bridle. Stop, Hank said, the word coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. Just stop for a minute and listen to me. Lila's hands stilled on the leather straps. But she didn't look at him. 5 years ago, when Martha died, I made a choice to shut down rather than deal with the pain of losing her. I pushed Sarah away because it hurt too much to see Martha's expressions in her face, to hear echoes of Martha's voice in the way she laughed. I thought I was protecting myself from more pain, but all I did was create a different kind of pain that lasted longer and cut deeper. He moved closer, gently taking the bridle from Lila's hands and setting it aside. Yesterday, Sarah offered me a chance to fix that mistake. A chance to be part of her life again, to have the kind of relationship with her that Martha would have wanted. And you know what? She was right to be angry when I didn't jump at that offer. Any reasonable man would have. Lila finally looked up at him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. But here's what she doesn't understand yet, and what I'm just starting to figure out myself. Sometimes the way forward isn't about going back to fix old mistakes. Sometimes it's about learning from those mistakes and choosing to do better with the opportunities you have right now. Hank pulled Thunder's saddle back up from where it had fallen, checking it for damage before setting it on the fence rail. I failed Sarah when she needed me most. I let my grief make me selfish and unavailable, and I can't undo that no matter how much I want to. But I don't have to fail you the same way. I don't have to let fear make me abandon someone who's counting on me. But your daughter, my daughter, is a strong, successful woman who has people in her life who love and support her. She'll be fine whether I'm part of her daily life or not. That doesn't mean I don't want to rebuild our relationship. I do, more than you can imagine. But it means I can't use her needs as an excuse to abandon my responsibilities to you. Hank began resaddling Thunder with deliberate movements, each action a statement of intent. Besides, he continued, I think Martha would have something to say about a man who breaks his promises to young people just because keeping them gets complicated. As if summoned by the mention of her name, a memory surfaced with startling clarity. Martha in their kitchen 3 years before she died, packing a care package for one of the teenagers from their church whose family had fallen on hard times. The measure of a man isn't what he does when it's easy, she'd said, wrapping homemade cookies in wax paper with the same care she'd have used for Sarah's birthday gifts. It's what he does when doing right costs him something he values. The memory was so vivid that Hank almost looked around to see if Martha was actually standing there, offering her gentle wisdom one more time. Instead, he found Lila watching him with an expression that held equal parts gratitude and concern. Are you sure? She asked quietly. Because once I ride tomorrow, there's no taking it back. If Sarah can't forgive you for choosing to help me, that's something you'll have to live with. I'm sure, Hank said, and realized as he spoke the words that they were true. The question is whether you're still sure. Because if we're doing this, we're doing it right. No half measures, no holding back, because you're worried about consequences that are mine to worry about. For the first time since arriving that morning, Lila smiled. Not the careful, guarded expression she usually wore, but something that lit up her entire face and reminded Hank powerfully of Sarah at that age, when the world still felt full of possibilities instead of limitations. "I'm sure," she said, reaching for Thunder's reins with hands that no longer shook. "More sure than I've ever been about anything." They spent the next 2 hours in final preparation, working through the technical details that could make the difference between a good ride and a great one. Hank watched Lila settle into the focused calm that marked natural competitors. Her earlier emotional turmoil transformed into the kind of determined concentration that separated successful riders from hopeful ones. As they were cooling down Thunder after the session, a familiar pickup truck turned into the driveway. Tommy Brennan climbed out, but instead of the cocky swagger that had characterized his earlier visits, he moved with the careful respect of someone approaching a place that had become sacred ground. "Afternoon, Mr. McCall, Lila." Tommy nodded to each of them in turn, then reached into his truck bed and pulled out a wooden box that looked like it had been recently polished. "I brought something I thought you might want to see." He carried the box to where they stood and opened it carefully, revealing the contents with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and arranged with obvious care, were dozens of belt buckles, ribbons, and trophies, a lifetime's worth of rodeo achievements that gleamed despite their age. "These belonged to Jake Morrison," Tommy said quietly. "The original Jake, I mean, Lila's father. Doc Peterson had them. Apparently Jake left them with the doc for safekeeping before his last competition, said he wanted to make sure they went to the right person if anything happened to him." Tommy lifted out a particularly impressive belt buckle, its silver surface engraved with the image of a bronc rider and the words, "Wyoming State Champion 1990. Doc says this was your father's first major win. He was 19 years old, younger than I am now, when he earned this. Doc thought you should have it, especially for tomorrow." Lila took the buckle with trembling hands, running her fingers over the engraved surface as if she could somehow absorb her father's skill and experience through touch. For a moment she was completely still, and Hank could see her processing this tangible connection to the parent she'd never known. "There's something else," Tommy continued, pulling out a faded program from the bottom of the box. "This is from his last competition, the one where he paused, seeming to search for the right words. The announcer called him a rider who understood that the horse was always the real champion, said Jake never tried to dominate an animal. Just find a way to work with them, even when they were trying their hardest to put him on the ground." The description fit perfectly with what Hank had observed about Lila's own approach to riding. She had the same instinctive understanding that the best rides came from partnership rather than conflict. The same ability to find rhythm and balance, even with difficult horses. "Thank you," Lila said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you can know," Tommy nodded, then surprised both of them by extending his hand to Lila in a gesture of genuine respect. "I want you to know that Jake and Buster and I will be cheering for you tomorrow. Not because we think it'll be entertaining to watch you try and fail, but because we genuinely hope you succeed. You've earned the right to be taken seriously." After Tommy left, Hank and Lila spent a few more minutes in comfortable silence, both of them processing the weight of what tomorrow would bring. The approaching storm had reached the valley, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall, sending horses running for shelter and filling the air with the electric smell of approaching thunder. "Ready?" Hank asked as they gathered up the tack and prepared to head for the barn. Lila looked down at her father's championship buckle, still clutched in her hand, then up at the storm clouds that seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence of the past few days. "Ready?" she said. And Hank believed her. Tomorrow would bring the rodeo, with all its possibilities for triumph or disaster. Tonight would bring whatever conversation awaited with Sarah, assuming she was willing to have one. But right now, in this moment, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years, the satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do, as they ran for the barn through the increasing rain. Martha's wedding dress trunk sat forgotten in the back room of the house, holding memories of a different kind of promise, a different vision of what family could look like. Tomorrow, Hank would have to choose once again between the family he'd lost and the one he might be building. But tonight, as thunder rolled across the valley and rain drummed on the barn roof, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to get it right. Rodeo morning arrived, with the kind of crisp clarity that only followed a good thunderstorm. The air washed clean and sharp with the scent of wet earth and sage. By 7 in the morning, Cedar Ridge had transformed itself from sleepy ranching town to something approaching genuine festivity. Pickup trucks lined both sides of Main Street, their license plates telling stories of journeys from as far away as Montana and Colorado. The rodeo grounds buzzed with activity as competitors checked equipment. Spectators claimed prime seating, and vendors set up booths selling everything from funnel cakes to hand-tooled leather goods. Hank found Lila waiting by his front gate as the sun crested the mountains, her canvas bag replaced by a proper gear bag that Tommy had insisted she borrow. She wore her father's championship buckle on a belt that was clearly too large for her slight frame, but the silver caught the morning light and seemed to give her an extra inch of height and confidence. Sleep at all? Hank asked as they walked toward the truck. Some you? Some. It was a generous description of the 3 hours of restless dozing he'd managed between worrying about Lila's safety and wondering if Sarah would be in the stands to watch. Ready for breakfast? They stopped at the Cedar Ridge Cafe, where May had prepared what she declared was a champion's breakfast. Eggs over easy, hash browns, bacon, and biscuits with honey butter. The restaurant was already busy with out-of-town visitors and local families gearing up for the day's events. But Hank noticed that several conversations quieted as he and Lila took their usual corner booth. "Whole town's talking about you," May said as she refilled Hank's coffee cup. "Most folks are pulling for you. Honey," she added to Lila, "though I'd be lying if I said there weren't a few bets being placed on whether you'll last the full 8 seconds. What kind of odds are they giving?" Lila asked with a slight smile. 3-1 against, last I heard. Though Tommy Brennan put $50 down on you winning the whole thing, which got people's attention. After breakfast, they drove to the rodeo grounds, where other competitors were already warming up their horses and going through final equipment checks. The ladies' bronc riding wouldn't begin until late morning, but Hank wanted Lila to get comfortable with the environment. The noise, the crowds, the controlled chaos that could rattle even experienced riders if they weren't prepared for it. Doc Peterson appeared at their truck almost before Hank had finished parking, carrying a wooden presentation box that looked like it had been specially prepared for the occasion. "Morning, Lila, Hank." The old doctor's usual gruff demeanor was tempered with something that looked almost like paternal pride. "Got something here that belongs to you." He opened the box to reveal another belt buckle, this one even more impressive than the championship buckle Tommy had brought the day before. The silver was polished to mirror brightness, engraved with intricate scrollwork, and the words, "Jake Morrison Memorial Trophy." "The Rodeo Association commissioned this last year," Doc Peterson explained. "Meant to present it to Jake's family, but nobody knew how to contact his daughter. Figured now was as good a time as any to rectify that oversight." Lila stared at the buckle with something approaching awe. "They made a memorial trophy for my father." "Jake Morrison was well respected in the rodeo community," Doc Peterson replied. "Not just for his riding, though that was exceptional, but for the way he conducted himself. Always helped younger riders, always made sure injured competitors got proper medical attention, never complained about judging decisions, even when he had reason to. The kind of man the sport needs more of." He closed the box and handed it to Lila. "This isn't just about honoring your father's memory. It's about recognizing that his legacy continues through you." Win or lose today, you've already proven you've got his heart and his character. As Doc Peterson walked away, Hank noticed that a small crowd had gathered to watch the exchange. Word was spreading through the rodeo grounds with the efficiency that only small communities could achieve. Jake Morrison's daughter was here, carrying on her father's tradition. Wearing his buckle and riding with his natural ability, the attention might have been overwhelming for some competitors, but Lila seemed to draw strength from it. She moved through the warm-up routine with increasing confidence, her interactions with other riders marked by the kind of respectful competitiveness that suggested she belonged in this world. Tommy, Jake and Buster appeared as Lila was finishing her practice session on one of the rodeo's gentler broncs. The three young men who'd started this whole situation with a cruel dare now watched her with expressions of genuine admiration and not a little nervousness. "How's she looking?" Tommy asked Hank quietly. "Like someone who knows what she's doing," Hank replied honestly. "Question is whether the horses will cooperate. Speaking of which," Buster interjected, "you might want to know that they've put her on Tornado for the first round." Hank felt his stomach tighten. Tornado was one of the more challenging horses in the rodeo stable, known for unpredictable bucking patterns that had unseated more than one experienced rider. It wasn't an impossible draw, but it wasn't a gentle introduction to competition riding either. "Could be worse," Jake offered optimistically. "At least it's not Widowmaker." "Could be better too," Tommy pointed out. "Though I guess if she can handle Tornado, she can handle anything they put her on." The announcement came over the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're 30 minutes away from the start of our ladies' bronc riding competition. Competitors, please check in at the registration table for your final equipment inspection and draw confirmation." Lila looked up at Hank with eyes that held no trace of doubt or fear, only determination, and something that might have been excitement. "Time to see what all this training was for," she said simply. As they walked toward the registration area, Hank caught sight of a familiar figure in the stands, Sarah, sitting with David about halfway up the bleachers, close enough to see everything clearly, but far enough away to avoid having to interact with him directly. She'd come after all, despite their argument, despite the harsh words and unresolved tensions. Maybe there was still hope for reconciliation, regardless of how today's competition turned out. Maybe Sarah would understand, eventually, that some commitments were worth keeping, even when they came at personal cost. But first they had to get through the next few hours. First, Lila had to prove to herself and everyone else that Jake Morrison's daughter belonged in this arena, that her father's legacy lived on not just in memory, but in skill and courage, and the kind of heart that refused to back down from a challenge. The registration line moved quickly, other competitors offering nods of encouragement and advice with the casual camaraderie that marked the rodeo community at its best. When they reached the front of the line, the official checked Lila's entry form and equipment with professional thoroughness before handing her a number to pin to her shirt. "You're riding third," he informed her. "Tornado in chute number 2. Good luck, miss. Make your daddy proud." The first two riders in the ladies' bronc competition provided a study in contrasts that reminded everyone why rodeo was as much about mental preparation as physical skill. Rebecca Martinez, a seasoned competitor from Laramie with 15 years of experience, drew thunder, the same horse Lila had been training with for weeks. She managed a respectable ride, staying mounted for the full 8 seconds and earning a score of 73 points from the judges. The second rider, a teenager named Amy Chen from Colorado Springs, lasted only 4 seconds on a horse called Midnight before hitting the dirt hard enough to require a few minutes of attention from the medical team. She walked away under her own power to encouraging applause. But the reminder of how quickly things could go wrong wasn't lost on anyone watching. As Lila's name was called, the crowd's murmur took on a different quality. This wasn't just another competitor. This was the girl whose story had captured the town's imagination. Jake Morrison's daughter making her debut on a horse that had a reputation for ending riders' days early. Hank walked with her toward chute number 2, where Tornado waited, with the kind of alert stillness that suggested he was already thinking about the most effective way to remove the rider from his back. The black gelding stood nearly 16 hands high, with the muscled build and intelligent eyes that marked horses bred specifically for rodeo competition. "Remember what we practiced," Hank said quietly as they approached the chute. "He's going to try to throw you off balance right out of the gate. So stay centered and move with him, not against him." Lila nodded, her hand instinctively moving to touch Martha's horseshoe charm that Hank had given her that morning for luck. The small silver piece had been Martha's most treasured possession, worn during every important event in her life, and Hank had pressed it into Lila's palm just before they left the ranch. "Your father would be proud," Hank added, meaning every word. "Win or lose, you've already proven you belong here." As Lila climbed onto the chute rails and lowered herself onto Tornado's back, the horse's ears flicked back toward her voice as she spoke to him in the same calm tones she'd used with every horse Hank had taught her to ride. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to the crowd, but it spoke to the kind of horsemanship that separated true riders from mere athletes. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen, riding Tornado in her very first competition, please welcome Lila Morrison." The use of her father's surname sent a ripple of recognition through the crowd. Someone had clearly done their homework, and the acknowledgement of her heritage brought a cheer that was part encouragement and part respect for the memory of a fallen champion. Lila settled into position, adjusting her grip on the rigging with the careful precision that weeks of training had made automatic. She nodded to the gate operator, and for a moment that seemed to stretch forever, everything was perfectly still. Then the gate swung open, and Tornado exploded into motion with the kind of athletic fury that had made him one of the rodeo circuit's most respected broncs. His first jump was straight up, all 4 hooves leaving the ground simultaneously, before he twisted in midair and came down hard on his front feet with a jarring impact that would have unseated most riders immediately. But Lila moved with him, her body flowing like water as she absorbed the shock and maintained her seat through the violent motion. Her free hand stayed high, away from the rigging, in perfect form, as Tornado began the series of spinning bucks that was his signature. The crowd's initial cheer gave way to focused silence as everyone realized they were witnessing something exceptional. This wasn't a novice rider hanging on desperately. This was someone who understood the rhythm of the horse's movement and was riding it like music. Tornado tried everything in his considerable repertoire. He spun left, then right, then launched himself into a series of straight-line bucks that built momentum like a freight train. Each time, Lila anticipated his movement a split second before it happened, adjusting her weight and position with the kind of instinctive timing that couldn't be taught. At the 6-second mark, Tornado attempted his favorite trick, a sudden stop and reversal that had sent countless riders flying over his head. But Lila had seen him do this exact maneuver during her training sessions, and she was ready for it. She sat back slightly, letting her weight shift with the horse's momentum, and stayed centered as Tornado spun in the opposite direction. The 8-second buzzer sounded, but Lila kept riding. The crowd was on its feet now, roaring approval as girl and horse continued their dance for another 3 seconds before she finally dismounted with a grace that made it look effortless. Tornado, his job done, trotted calmly toward the gate, as if he too understood that something special had just occurred. Lila landed on her feet, stumbled slightly, then raised her arms to acknowledge the crowd's thunderous approval. From the stands, Hank could see Sarah standing and applauding with tears streaming down her face. David was shouting something that was lost in the noise, but his expression of amazement was clear enough. Even the other competitors were cheering, recognizing that they'd witnessed the kind of ride that defined careers. The judges' scores came back quickly, 89 points, the highest first-round score in the competition's history. But more than the numbers, more than the technical excellence of her ride, was the way Lila had transformed from nervous teenager to confident competitor in the space of 8 seconds. As she walked back toward the chutes, accepting congratulations from riders and spectators alike, Lila caught Hank's eye across the arena. Her smile was radiant, transformed by the joy of discovering what she was truly capable of when everything came together perfectly. She had honored her father's memory and exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. But more than that, she had found herself, not the lost girl living in an abandoned barn, but the rider she'd always been meant to become. The competition wasn't over. There would be additional rounds for the top finishers. But in that moment, surrounded by the cheers of people who'd started the day as strangers and ended it as admirers, Lila Morrison had already won everything that truly mattered. 3 months later, autumn had settled over Cedar Ridge with the kind of gentle beauty that made longtime residents remember why they'd chosen to build their lives in this valley. The aspens on the mountainsides had turned gold, their leaves catching the afternoon light like scattered coins, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter still weeks away. Hank stood in his kitchen, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time, and wondered when getting dressed up had become such an ordeal. The truth was, he hadn't worn anything fancier than his Sunday church clothes in years, and the formal attire required for Sarah's wedding felt foreign after so many months of work shirts and jeans. "You look handsome," Lila said from the doorway, and Hank turned to see her in the pale blue dress Sarah had chosen for her role as bridesmaid. The transformation from the thin, desperate girl he'd met 6 months ago was remarkable, not just in the way she'd filled out with regular meals and a stable home, but in the confidence that radiated from her posture and the genuine smile that had replaced her former guardedness. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Hank replied, meaning it. "Your father would be proud to see you today." The mention of Jake Morrison no longer brought the shadow of pain it once had. Lila had found peace with her father's memory, integrating his legacy into her identity without letting it define her completely. The regional rodeo circuit had taken notice of her debut performance, and several college programs had already expressed interest in offering her scholarships. But she'd made it clear that education came first. Veterinary school, she'd decided, would let her help animals the way Hank had helped her. The adoption papers had been finalized just 2 weeks ago, a legal formality that reflected what had become emotional reality months earlier. Lila Morrison McCall had a family now, roots that went deeper than shared genetics, connections built on choice rather than accident of birth. "Ready?" she asked, adjusting the small bouquet that marked her role in the wedding party. "Ready," Hank confirmed, though he felt anything but prepared for the conversation that was sure to come. The wedding was being held at the ranch Martha had loved, in the meadow where she'd once talked about having Sarah's ceremony back, when such things seemed like distant possibilities rather than immediate realities. Sarah had initially resisted the idea. Too many memories, she'd said. Too much emotional weight for what should be a celebration. But David had quietly suggested that maybe it was time to transform painful associations into joyful ones. The guest list was small, but meaningful. Family friends, colleagues from David's firm, some of Sarah's friends from Denver, and most of Cedar Ridge's permanent residents. Tommy, Jake, and Buster had volunteered to handle parking and act as unofficial ushers, their transformation from antagonists to allies complete. Doc Peterson would perform the ceremony, having been ordained online specifically for the occasion after the intended minister came down with pneumonia. As the ceremony began, Hank found himself thinking about Martha and the conversations they might have had about this day. She would have loved seeing Sarah so happy, would have fussed over every detail while pretending the whole affair wasn't making her emotional. She would have welcomed David into the family with the same generous spirit she'd shown everyone who'd mattered to the people she loved. Sarah looked radiant as she walked down the makeshift aisle, her dress simple but elegant, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged. David waited for her with an expression of such obvious adoration that even Hank's reservations about his son-in-law melted away completely. The vows they'd written were personal, without being overly intimate, full of promises about supporting each other's dreams and building a life together that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment. When Doc Peterson pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. The reception was held in the ranch's main yard, with tables set up under strings of lights that would provide magic once the sun set. May had coordinated the catering with military precision, ensuring there was enough food to satisfy everyone, from the vegetarian friends of David's to the ranchers who considered a meal incomplete without beef. It was during the father-daughter dance that Hank finally had the conversation he'd been both anticipating and dreading. Sarah's head rested on his shoulder as they moved to music Martha would have recognized, an old country waltz that spoke of enduring love and simple pleasures. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible over the music. "About what I said before the rodeo, about having to choose between Lila and me. That wasn't fair. You weren't wrong," Hank replied honestly. "I did abandon you when you needed me most. I let my grief make me selfish. But you didn't abandon Lila when she needed you. And watching her ride that day, seeing what you'd helped her become, I understood something I'd been too hurt to see before." Sarah pulled back slightly so she could look at him directly. "Love isn't finite. Dad, having Lila in your life doesn't mean you love me less. Just like me getting married doesn't mean I don't need my father anymore. It just means we're all learning how to make room for more people in our hearts." The wisdom in her words reminded Hank so powerfully of Martha that he had to blink back unexpected tears. "When did you get so smart?" "I had good teachers," Sarah replied with a smile, "even when they were too stubborn to realize what they were teaching." Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to filter back toward town, Hank found himself on the front porch with the new family photograph Doc Peterson had insisted on taking. It showed 4 people, Hank, Sarah, David, and Lila, but somehow captured the presence of others as well. Martha's influence was there in the way Sarah held herself, in the flowers from her garden that decorated the tables. Jake Morrison's legacy lived in Lila's confident smile and the championship buckle she wore even with her bridesmaid dress. Sarah and David would be moving to Colorado Springs as planned. Close enough for regular visits, but far enough to build their own life together. Lila would finish high school in Cedar Ridge before heading off to college, but she'd already made it clear that this ranch would always be home. The land Martha had loved would continue to nurture new generations, to provide the stability and connection that made everything else possible. As the last of the guests departed and the lights were extinguished, Hank sat on his porch with Lila beside him, both of them processing the day's emotions in comfortable silence. The stars were brilliant in the clear autumn sky, the same constellations Martha had pointed out during their own wedding night 35 years ago. "Think she would have approved?" Lila asked, following his gaze upward. "Martha never met a celebration she didn't love," Hank replied. "She would have been in her element today. I meant about me. About you taking in a stray teenager and turning your life upside down for someone who wasn't even family." Hank considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman who'd spent her life opening their home and hearts to anyone who needed what they could offer. She would have said that family isn't about blood, it's about choice, about people deciding to stick with each other through whatever comes. And she would have been right. The night air was getting cold, promising frost by morning, but neither of them seemed inclined to go inside just yet. This was one of those moments that deserved to be savored, when everything felt balanced and right and full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Lila would return to school and continue her training for next season's rodeo competitions. Sarah would call from her honeymoon, excited to share details about places she'd only dreamed of visiting. The ranch would continue its cycle of seasons and routines, now enriched by the presence of someone young enough to see wonder in things Hank had started taking for granted. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of love chosen rather than inherited, of second chances seized rather than missed, Hank McCall felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years, complete contentment with the life he was living rather than the one he'd lost. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer frightening, full of the kind of possibilities that came when people decided to believe in each other despite the risks. And in the gentle silence of the Wyoming night that felt like more than enough,